begin this panel with an anecdote. As I mentioned in one of the previous panels, I was a correspondent in Brazil, and when I moved to Brazil at the start of 2014, Sao Paulo, which is where I was based, was going through its historic water crisis. Its historic drought, in inverted commas. The reason for the inverted commas will become apparent in a moment. But then you look at the pictures of the drought in Sao Paulo, and you would have these devastating-looking images of empty reservoirs with cracked, sort of baked earth, somehow surrounded by lush tropical vegetation. So this drought was sort of incongruous with this image. Yes, the reservoirs are empty, but there's still a lot of green about, so it can't have been entirely an absence of water, because without water, with a genuine deep drought, you would not have the green. So what became apparent to me very quickly is that the drought problem in Sao Paulo was not a problem of resource scarcity. It seemed to be more of a problem of the scarcity of good management. So of mismanagement of a resource, which was in many ways abundant. So in that record drought year, Sao Paulo still got over 1,000 millimeters of water of rainfall, which is 3 times what Los Angeles gets in a good year, and possibly about 10 times what Las Vegas gets. So drought is a relative term. And so I would like to maybe start with this question. How much of the water stress problem that we hear about all the time, that hits the headlines everywhere, is a problem of genuine scarcity of a resource versus mismanagement? Should we start with you, Michelle?
Sure, but I'm curious with the rest of the panel.
I want to let them off the hook, don't worry.
So I love what you said about resource management, and I think about resource allocation, because depending on where you are, water is hyper-local. So here in Chicago, we have at times too much of it. We used to be a swamp. In places out in the West, it's drought conditions. But no matter where you are, you're having much more erratic weather. And so to your point about mismanagement, I would say yes, and it's also a need to build in resiliency to a system that has been in some ways the phrase one-trick pony, if you will. Let it all come to a place and clean it up and distribute. That just can't work anymore. There has to be a more diversified approach. And at the Nature Conservancy, we would argue vigorously that nature and slowing down the water cycle is an important process.
Can I just add that, if I could reframe your question in terms of the factors, let's say it is prominent. Well, your point is well taken. And whether it be industry, domestic, or agricultural use, I think to build on Michelle's point, one factor is water is inexpensive. Not only is it local, but it's cheap, and there is this, in some cases, this inverse relationship between the way water is priced and the water stress conditions in that area. So what ends up happening is the behavior is, I'm going to use it lavishly because it's inexpensive. There really is no impact to me personally. And so one of the things at Ecolab, to that point, is we created a public tool called the Water Risk Monetizer, which looks at any water user can access it publicly to look at the full value of water beyond the market price, because we know the market price is not priced appropriately. And that accounts for things like groundwater recharge. It accounts for things like biodiversity and other factors that are social implications to the way water is being managed in that area.
So that's the point. That's the question I wanted to ask you, Jim, and that's sort of really highlights Emilio's comment. Really highlights sort of an incredibly interesting tension within the providers for utilities providing this particular resource to people, because in a way, you often traditionally utilities make money by charging a certain sum for a certain amount of water used, right? So the more you use, the more somebody uses, the more revenue that generates for you as the utility. Right. And at the same time, you need to make sure that you're sort of responsible stewards of that water for the longer term so that your revenue stream doesn't dry up, as it were, in the long run. So how do you resolve that tension as a big water utility?
Well, I tell people that our business model is that we're a monopoly. We sell a product that is essential for human life, and we have to sell it at the lowest price possible, and we have to convince our customers not to use our product. Great
and you took this
and
job.
I'm the CEO of this place. So.
You took this job. Brave man.
No, we have to obviously recover our costs for our long-term investment in our infrastructure, but we also need to send price signals to our customers as to that the more you use, the more you're going to have to pay for. And so we do get blowback from our customers who say, well, you're charging me more and I'm using less. We're selling about the same amount of water as we did in the 1970s to about 1 million more people than we were serving in the 1970s. And it's all because of efficiency, because of price structure, and the fact is that we will keep raising rates to pay for that.
Do you raise incremental rates, like marginal rates, or are they stable? It's like if for the first cubic meter you pay X, and then for the second cubic meter you pay, and whatever factor times X.
It's a tiered structure, so the more you use, the more you pay per unit of water. Yep.
And that clearly had an effect. And
the price signal works. Yeah.
Do you know how widespread this sort of pricing is in water utilities? Because I have to say I haven't come across it, but then again, that could be just because I haven't looked into it deep enough.
In the Western U.S., it's very common, and we'll also price according to water budgets. So a specific property we will say to that customer, here's how much water you should be using. And we can use technology basically to identify homeowners on a home-by-home basis and how much water they're using and communicate to them. You could be saving money if you were using less water and your landscaping would be just as lush as it is right now.
Luca, I wanted to ask you about, sort of, as a consumer of water, in your production.
Yep.
But also as a sort of almost indirect consumer of water when your product is consumed by the consumer, right? Because you sell pasta, and pasta is dry.
Yeah, that's right.
And then you have to cook it,
water.
and you cook it by putting it in water, and then something happens to that water. But it's water. Do you account for that in your calculations of how much water goes into your supply chain?
Yeah. Yeah, when I started about 15 years ago, in order to make the life cycle analysis of the product, one of the issues is that the pasta, we have to cook it. And so we started to understand how much it is the water that we used during the agriculture phase, how much during our production phase, and how much during the cooking phase. What came out was quite interesting because about 95% of the water that we use, it is in the agriculture phase. Is
that the same, because you produce around the world, is that the same in all countries?
Yes, more or less. Because, also the amount of water that we use, it's not a lot, because normally we do not use the irrigation for the durum wheat, because it is a cultivation that can be easily cropped in an area where it is enough the rain. Mm-hmm. That's right. Even if in Italy we try to move some cultivation from the desert of the United States about 6 or 7 years ago, because we introduced a high quality durum wheat in Italy. And for this reason, we moved some of the production of the cultivation of durum wheat from the desert to Italy. And this can move more or less 40 million cubic meter of water, of blue water, because cultivated in Italy without using the irrigation instead of desert in the United States, move this amount of water. And the number was very, very high.
Was that offset in any way by the subsequent transport costs? I mean, obviously not with water, but it wouldn't offset the water use, but would it sort of you know, you add an additional carbon footprint, for instance, by having to transport the wheat from from the, you know,
Yep.
where you grow it to where you process it.
Yes. Also, if there was quite interesting because doing this kind of exercise, for example, to move from Canada to Italy, if it's done by ship or a train that normally happen, have a lower environmental impact in terms of carbon footprint for the transport compared to the durum wheat that you produce in Sicily, but you move from the Sicily to northern part of Italy by truck. And it sounds strange, but it was like that. Right. And also the amount of the type of cultivation have a big impact, because if you make a cultivation the right way, using the right rotation and using less fertilizer, then you can reduce, in any case, also 30% the carbon footprint of the product.
Do you presumably you outsource the cultivation of your crops?
Yes.
You don't do it yourself?
Yes, no.
So to what extent, I mean, so coming back to the earlier panel I chaired this morning on supply chains.
Yep.
To what extent do you monitor, you know, how deeply do you monitor the resource use, specifically water use, of the providers of your inputs? Mm-hmm. And is it something that could actually turn you off a certain producer and make sure, prompt you to choose another supplier?
The project that we have done for the cultivation of durum wheat in Italy, we started about 7 years ago. When you talk before that, how much time you take in order to develop a project, when we talk about sustainable project, in any case, it is a long-term project. Yeah. And 7 years ago, we started with the Barilla Sustainable Farming Project that give an help to the farmer in order to do the right techniques for the cultivation. And giving them as a tool, a web-based tool, will give them link to the weather forecast, what to do and when to do exactly according to the forecast of the weather. And this way, it's possible to reduce the amount of fertilizer that normally have a higher impact also in the CO2 emission, because able in order to have a higher yield and the better quality. And so in such a way, it was possible now about 400 of kilotons of durum wheat will be cultivated in such a way in next 2 years.
Has Barilla's business actually been materially affected by any droughts? Like, have you had to, you know, turn down production because it suddenly turned out that you don't have enough inputs, or are you always able to get inputs from somewhere else?
Due to the fact that we have some kind of cultivation, in particular in Italy, for cultivation contract, so we are able also to buy from different area of Italy, for example, and due to the fact also that durum wheat, it is quite drought resistant, because it is this kind of cultivation. We normally are able to find a way. But also this kind of decision supporting system can give an help also in order to manage in the right way the different weather condition and to adapt to the climate change. One of the things that I was surprised, but was quite easy, it is due to the fact that this kind of tools is based on the weather condition, they are able to give the right suggestion to the farmers in order to adapt when the weather was not as we expected.
Mm-hmm. Emilia, I wanted to turn to you. So Luca said that as far as his supply chain is concerned, so it was 95% of the water of the water consumption is in the agricultural part. Yep. You work with many different sectors at Ecolabs. And so are there any sectors in particular that you think are, A, doing a particularly good job at managing their resources, or sectors of maybe countries or geographical areas where resource management is exemplary? And the second more controversial question, are there any that lag behind, that are particularly bad? You don't have to name any companies,
sure.
But so it would be nice to know if there's a sector which is not really up to snuff?
So I would say that we've had a number of food and beverage industry partners on stage today, including Barilla. And I would say that food and beverage clearly is an example where they've taken the steps operationally to really manage water very effectively because they've recognized the reputational risk factors associated with it. But I think what cuts across all industries has been the challenge is supply chain. And I think you see it clearly, more prominently with the food and beverage industry. If you take other industries like the chemical sector and material sector, there it's, yes, you have a feedstock in oil and intermediates, but there is a significant operational intensity when it comes to water and energy production. And so the focus there is that's where their materiality and relevance is. So it all depends on the industry. Do I see one industry standing out? I think if I look at technology and cloud-based computing, we have all these data centers, obviously, that are just like sprouting up everywhere. And in many cases, they're sprouted out not necessarily where water is plentiful, because they're putting them there because of what? The demand. You have to have one in Central California. You have to have one in Bali. You have to have one in Cape Town, where water is at risk. And so what ends up happening is I've seen that industry, for example, taking steps to start to look at alternative ways to utilize fresh water that doesn't necessarily require potable water, community drinking water that Jim spoke about. Take an example, we worked with Microsoft at a San Antonio data center, which was at risk. It was a hot spot for them. The San Antonio watershed, the Leon Creek watershed, was at risk in terms of quantity and quality. And by the way, I think that's one key point to this availability issue that you spoke of, is that really what drives that in many cases is quality. Quality is compromised, so therefore you either use more or you have to put more effort into making it work. But in the case of Microsoft, they were able to utilize a purple pipe strategy, which for those that are from California know, there's gray water available, a third pipe, as Jan talked about it earlier, that's made available in some communities to really be able to use it in the right situations that's fit for use. Clearly, it wouldn't be used as ingredient water in the food and beverage industry. But in cooling critical data centers, it worked out really well. We were able to use the right filtration technology to manage the variability of that water quality, which changes, as you know, day to day. And that allowed us to use smart technology and sensors to really control that quality, so that the biggest thing they were after was reliability. The last thing you want is a disruption at Microsoft or Google in terms of their data center when it comes to information in the cloud.
So what about the laggards? Any particular laggards?
I would say that, due to lack of awareness, I would say the institutional marketplace in urban areas, buildings of large hospitality spaces, are starting to realize how vital water is to their operations, to being able to drive that guest satisfaction at a beautiful place like this here today. I think the institutional, building management market is one that is really starting to accelerate. I would also say that the B2B organizations are ones that are starting to really catch up with the consumer packaged goods companies. They haven't had to face the challenges.
Reputational challenges are very different for them than they are for consumer-facing.
Exactly.
industries.
So I think those are probably the industries that are catching up to the consumer packaged goods.
Joe, I have a similar question to you. Of your clients, are there any particular groups, either in industrial sectors or sort of consumers, farmers versus industry, that have made, according to you and what you see, particular strides in their water use over the years?
I think across the board, large buildings, the marijuana industry in Colorado is highly water efficient. They're in the ag business, and they're in grow facilities, in warehouses and other operations, and we work with them very directly on their water efficiency. I think on a broader scale, going back to your question about drought versus water management and water pricing, to me, the biggest problem in at least the western U.S. is the fact that the water is essentially free, that it is a property right that's owned by the individual owner, and there's not a real market to transfer water freely among various uses, and there's no incentive to conserve, and there's no incentive to essentially work deals. It's all buy and sell. It's all a zero-sum game, so it's taking from one sector and going to another sector, and there's no active trading or economic incentive to move water from one economic use to another economic use.
So are there any places in the world where the property rights, because water is notoriously difficult when it comes to property rights.
Yeah.
Partly because it flows, right? It's not in one place.
Right.
And what you do with it upstream affects what happens downstream. And then the example very often invoked in this context is Australia, which has a sort of a relatively well-developed trading scheme for property rights, or an auction and trading scheme. Are there any places, I mean, maybe apart from Australia, that you think serve as good examples of how water rights can be managed well?
It's
Within
tough.
the US, for that
Yeah, it's
matter.
tough. I mean, you look at the Murray-Darling Basin in Australia is held up as the model for a crisis hit. We put in this trading scheme. The problem is that it is failing to work now because of the tragedy of the commons effect, because upstream farmers are basically taking the water and using it, and the government is not regulating the market sufficiently, and so the system is kind of breaking down because of lack of political will to actually enforce the market from happening. So the equivalent to the economic meltdown of failure of regulators.
Michelle,
I just wanted to add
Yeah.
regarding Murray-Darling, the Nature Conservancy, in partnership with an investment partner, put together a credit trading fund where basically this body with investor money purchases the water rights and then has a scheme, not a Ponzi scheme, but a plan in order to give farmers the water when they need it and when they don't need it to replenish the wetland. And so that it's almost creating a mini world where the regulation works. The issue with this fund, though, is it's $20 million in this fund, which is this.
a drop in the ocean.
A drop in the ocean. And so it's really thinking about scalability of solutions that align users and payers in a way that forces efficiency.
So actually, the number of water-based metaphors that we will inadvertently use today just goes to show how important that resource is. But do you have any examples from elsewhere where you think, even at the local level, water is managed well? Managed in the sense of property rights in this particular context?
I'll give an example. We at the Nature Conservancy call them water funds. There are 30 some odd in existence around the world, and we have intention to get to 70 by 2022, I believe the number is. Again, there could be thousands of cities that could be using this sort of mechanism. But basically, I'll use Quito as an example because it's an older project. 15 years ago, the water utility in Quito set up the rules so that their ratepayers would pay for upstream or watershed restoration. And the issues there were farming, subsistence farming in the Paramo, the high Andes, and also inefficient farming and a lot of sedimentation. And so these farmers weren't laughing all the way to the bank with their practices. They were trying to and continue to feed their families and live a modest life. But with some making them whole and practices, the water in Quito is much cleaner, and the return on investment is about 2 to 1 for invested. Now, not every geography will lend to that, but it does require, and I look to you, Emilio, because Ecolabs, and with a little bit of our help too, has created a urban water blueprint. We're basically looking at each city and saying, okay, is your trouble scarcity and or quality? And what are some of the nature-based solutions that you might be incorporating? And oh, hey, by the way, what other cities are like you? So it's a tool.
Could you tell us about that a little bit?
That was one of the factors, John, that I think, early, your very first question, which is, we talked about local, we talked about undervalued water. We talk about, I think the third being dialogue and awareness in terms of collaboration. I think the big thing that came out of this work is that we found that more and more people were unaware of even where water is sourced. And that's a challenge and a problem because you can't fix it. The other is, if you go to operational water, to Luca's point, it's not knowing how water is being utilized in your facility when it comes to metering or sub-metering. And that's across all industries. And so to the point about the collaboration, I think, is that more than ever, we find that organizations and water users are kind of living in isolation. Mm-hmm. They're kind of all doing their own thing. Mm-hmm. And so if I reduce my water use at my facility by 30% and you use 30% more in that same watershed, have we really done anything? And the answer is no. And so this collaboration, I think, is a really key to driving stewardship, which I think is ultimately where we need to go. And so there's an example of that, not only with TNC, but also in California with a group called the California Water Action Collaborative, mm-hmm. another Western state that's been stressed with some water issues in recent years. And that is that industry coming together in the Santa Ana watershed, there's about 12 to 15 different companies, along with TNC, along with other NGOs, where we're building collective action around how we're using water within our own facilities in that watershed. And so the idea is to be able to say, I can learn a best practice that I can share with you, and we can all work together then to improve the health of that watershed.
Is that more efficient than price? Or is that, because the reason I ask is, I'm a consumer of water, obviously, and when my wife and I moved to London, we got slapped. We used water sparingly. I mean, we don't take baths. We take showers. We don't.
Depends how long.
We don't take. In Sao Paulo, actually, we moved. We had a huge jacuzzi, which I didn't use a single time in 3.5 years because of my conscience, basically. But yeah, so we got slapped with our very first water bill. Came from Thames Water. It was stratospheric.
Right.
And immediately after getting that bill, we just started using water even more sparingly than we had been using it before. So we didn't have we didn't have a dishwasher, so we would hand wash our dishes, and the leftover water we would actually use to flush toilets or to water plants or whatever it was. But that price signal was absolutely critical in changing our behavior. Obviously, the problem is, and you mentioned Quito, the famous sort of water wars and over whether water is, according to a lot of campaigners, water is a right. It's not a commodity. Everybody should have it in abundance, and somebody should be tasked with providing it in as much, in quantities as high as consumers want. Is that a problem? I mean, wouldn't just setting reasonable prices, like Jim's company has been doing, isn't that enough? Do we need to do more?
I would say yes. I would say that I think it's what the pricing mechanism does is it starts to look at the value of water to that domestic use or that business. And I think the other is there still has to be, and we talked about this earlier, movement from this, I use it and I dispose of it. And I'm done with it. It's so linear. And we today, the stat is that less than 3% of the wastewater on this earth is actually reclaimed and reused. I think the stat is even, you spoke about plastics earlier this morning. That's even worse than the plastic recycling issue. And so water is a finite resource. And so the opportunity, I think, is also to start to drive more of that circular thinking that allows us to really utilize things like the San Antonio example with gray water in industry, places where we know, in developed countries, water used in industry is much greater than what we know as a universal agricultural number that says that 70% of water, fresh water, is going to ag, when in places like the United States and in Europe, it's more like greater than 50% is going to industry. And so I think there's opportunities there to start to move not only with the pricing strategy and looking at the full value of water, but also about circular management, which is something I think we're still lagging.
Luca, your suppliers, do they complain ever about the rising price of water? Is this, is that a justification they give, for instance, for the rising price of produce that they provide to you?
But normally in our plant we have some wheels, so we use and extract from the ground. But before we talk about circularity, this is absolutely important because, for example, we use the wheel, but then we use that kind of water in order to cool some equipment, but then we give to the farmers on the land near the plant that during the summer are able to make the cultivation using our water. So in such a case, we have an agreement also with the public agreement that each year we have to take out from the wheel an amount of water that need from the farmers near the plant in order to be able to cultivate. So when I started to reduce this kind of amount, then I have to stop because otherwise the farmers, our neighbors, were not able to have the water, and then they have to find somewhere with another wheel how to take out the water. So the circularity, it is absolutely essential when we talk about water. In this case, we have to stop to reduce the use of the water in order to give the reuse of that for the agricultural phase.
But has price, coming back to my question, has price actually, have you seen the effect of rising water prices on the price that you have to pay for the commodity that you use to make the product?
Still not, because using us the durum wheat, normally it is rain fed, so it's not a big problem, this. And normally the cost, there are other costs. And for our facility, in any case, the cost of the water, also for the extraction, is very low. Mm-hmm. And I agree that we need to give more, to cost more money the water in order to manage well. Because also when we do some reduction or some return on investment for the water, normally we do without looking which kind of return on investment we have, because the cost that is so low that we do because we decided this is a good thing to do, not because there's a return on investment.
I think the city of Chicago, and I know Michelle brought this up, Mayor Emanuel has made water a platform for his mayorship. And water, we have a plant that's probably about 12 miles from here. It's our largest water user. We have 120 facilities globally, and it's using Lake Michigan water. And quite honestly, we found out that there was risk with Lake Michigan water, not because of availability, but because of quality and the nutrient and issues because of runoff into the lake. And to add to that, the challenge was the mayor did announce that he was accelerating the price increases out to 2020, which actually drove our facility into a capital management plan that allowed us to reuse and recycle.
What was the response? What was the consumer's response to that announcement? Were they up in arms?
I don't know if I have any evidence that was the case, but quite honestly, with a century-old water system, I don't know if they had any other choice.
There wasn't. It's so underpriced that I don't think incrementally we moved the needle to where it was painful.
I think the pricing question to me is not for what Denver Water will price to incent our customers, but across the spectrum, there's no 80 to 90% of the water use in the Western United States is by agriculture, and it's either government subsidized through Bureau of Reclamation or federal project water, or it's essentially free through a water right, and so there's no pricing of the right to extract, in essence, a public resource to reflect the true costs of that water supply. So until that pricing and the economy, and there's an open and free transaction of the right to use that resource, We're just operating in silos.
Yeah.
And I would argue that, and we've had this conversation, that these silos between whether it's farmers not wanting to be regulated, plainly, and NGOs, perhaps like the Nature Conservancy, doing work like in the Saginaw Bay to protect watershed from farm runoff, and the utilities who are bearing the brunt, mostly because they're regulated under the Clean Water Act from 1970, and if they have certain standards. We haven't, into our agricultural practices, which is the elephant in the room, to use the phrase from earlier, internalized those costs. And so right now there are a lot of people and good corporations thinking about it, and farmers themselves thinking about it, but that remains a place for advancement.
Hi, Andy Mangan, and with the U.S. Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm curious about water trading, and it's as something that's been discussed, talked about, examined in the Ohio River Valley, for example, but the idea of nutrient load and water trading systems, has any of you had anything to do with that, and if so, what was your experience?
Anyone on the panel?
Yes, I've tried to make some exercise of water trading calculation, but it is quite interesting to understand because we have the flow of the raw material from of the durum wheat that normally we have about here in the United States, 100% is coming from Canada or United States, so we are more or less, this is the amount. But it is something that it is interesting as an exercise, but on the practical level, it's not easy also to explain, because when I make the calculation, then I try to explain to our colleague. There was a problem also that it is the opposite that you think normally you manage. When you are able to export, and then the water, because you have the grain, the durum wheat is used coming to produce, and then you export the pasta, for example. So we are moving water through the pasta, inside the pasta, because you use in this way into the country that normally do not have a lot of water, and this is something good. But it is not easy to explain.
There are pockets of markets in the Western U.S. in particular. It's politically and socially a tough issue to overcome because farmers will talk to each other in a certain area, and no one wants to be the one to sell out, if you will. And so there's a lot of peer pressure among the agricultural producing company just to hold their water and just wait, and just it's almost like we're going to build a wall and around us to protect us because the utilities are going to come and take our water. And as a utility, we're not looking to take anybody's water. What we would like to do is have innovative transactions to be able to use water during certain times, work with the agricultural community to essentially borrow water in dry times and let them use it in wet times. Maybe the environment can have some of that water and we can basically share and move it. But I'm not aware of any place where that type of a transactional environment is really working.
Ken Richards, Indiana University. We had the pleasure of living in Singapore for some time, and they have a rather advanced water system. And it's said that no drop of water that falls on Singapore reaches the ocean. And I'm wondering if you're familiar with that process. How did they accomplish that? And more importantly, what were the greatest challenges in getting to that outcome?
Emilio, do you work in Singapore?
I've got a smile on my face. The short answer is it's an island.
Right.
They have to. And they refer to it as new water.
Yeah.
And so there's
With one W, it's one word. NEWATER.
Right. And they have done a remarkable job, I would argue, in marketing themselves as a society that's going to drive circularity because their communities need to thrive and their business is going to grow, and they continue to do that. Now, there's other parts of the world, like here, where we have perhaps not as good marketing in talking about toilet to tap. So I don't know, there's a stigma in when you hear that to say, you know, I think I'll pass.
Yeah, new water sounds better.
Yeah, it does. So that's my
I was actually brought up in Singapore, and I remember cycling around the reservoirs they have there. But the one reason that Singapore is so self-sufficient in water is that it was permanently afraid that Malaysia, where it would draw most of its water from, the reservoirs were there for emergencies, right? In case Malaysia turned off the tap.
Right.
Basically. And because of the fraught geopolitical relationship between Singapore and Malaysia, they basically wanted to ensure self-reliance lest Malaysia decides that it no longer wants to sell water to Singapore. So there was a very strong geopolitical incentive to create the system that Singapore has created. So, but Singapore is such a peculiar place that it's sort of, even though the Chinese do appear to want to be a big Singapore, it's just so idiosyncratic that it's and so rich and so small that it's really difficult to transpose any, however wonderful solutions that they have there to a place like the United States. I'm afraid that that's the case.
Jennifer Turner, I spoke on the last, director of the China Environment Forum at the Wilson Center. So I've been, the last couple of years, I've been diving into wastewater and sludge, metaphorically speaking, in China.
Physically? No.
No. Because I mean, China, every year they produce like 5 Giza pyramids full of sludge, and only one of the pyramids is treated. So I've been trying to gather stories in the US on good sludge to energy or poop to power, if we want to be really funny about it. And I was kind of curious, maybe checking with Denver, do you guys have a good story to tell, or do anyone else hear about stories that we can tell in China about how methane capture from wastewater and sludge becomes a money-making and lowering the price? Because you keep talking about price here today, Yen.
Well, we are the economists. So.
You are the economist, yeah. And so, I mean, this is an idea. This should be, I mean, it's happening in the U.S., but any
It's
good
definitely
stories?
happening in the U.S. I mean, there's a growing movement in the wastewater treatment community about viewing, not even calling it wastewater, but calling it a resource, and be able to extract everything from that resource and be able to essentially make it into a commodity, make money off of it.